Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to another session of the ABC of Contemporary Capital with David Harvey, hosted at the People's Forum. We're on session 9 today. Just a reminder for schedule, we won't have a class on April 19th, but we will on the 26th and the 3rd. And for those watching on YouTube, it will be live streamed for you to watch as well. Keep putting questions into the chat. Please keep looking at davidharvey.org and adding comments to the session texts. And with that, I'll pass it over to David.
Okay, well, thanks, Talia. And here we are discussing session 8 and getting ready for to plunge into session 9. You may, I hope one of the things you've noticed is that out of respect for the idea of the totality, I try each week to sort of find the link between what's gone previously and what we're now on. So this week, the discussion is about section 8, which is about the fixed capital and consumption fund. And of course, that sort of matches rather neatly the whole kind of stuff about rate and mass, in the sense that there is a part of the investment in fixed capital, which is about the machinery stuff and what goes on inside the firm and so on, which is very much about providing the wherewithal to sort of increase the productivity of labor. So, and insofar as it does that, of course, it contributes very much to the falling rate of profit. But then when it comes to fixed capital of an independent kind and the consumption fund, we're dealing with all sorts of things like real estate and consumer durables and so on, which are much more about the absorption of the mass rather than the production of the mass. And so that in a sense, fixed capital operates on both sides of the falling rate and rising mass. It absorbs some of the, it has a very important role to play in absorption of the increasing mass, and it has a very important role to play in terms of increasing the productivity of labor and therefore contributing to the falling rate. So the topic this week is about fixed capital and the consumption fund, and I just want to sort of throw it open to people in the class, or people also, of course, in the chat room if they want to raise any particular questions you have about what is going on in this particular session. So anybody got some things they want to say about it straight out? Is it all sort of clear?
I'll ask a question, Professor. When you talk on page 8, and you say that you talk about the circulation of fixed capital, excuse me, the circulation of fixed capital hardening into a separate circulatory process. And I'm just very interested in, this idea of circulation. So you have these things which are really processes that might appear stable, like fixed capital, like a factory would appear fixed, and yet it's in motion. This idea of it being in motion, and so the useful, like the contradiction between the contradictory unity, I think you say, in between the motion and the fixity, that when you talk about it hardening into a separate circulatory process, is that a distinction between fixed capital as machinery, for example, that produces commodities and sort of apartment buildings and stuff that was once a commodity but is now no longer it's no longer for sale. But it's still existent. Is that one way of understanding?
I wouldn't take it in that way. Here's the way I would take that. I start off by talking about fixated capital. And you know, you'd like to think it's in motion all the time, but you know it's not. And you know, there's inventory sitting around, and so there's fixated capital. And some of that is going to happen no matter what, because you've always got, you know, you need a supply of raw materials at the front of the factory, not being used until it's brought into the factory. You know, in other words, there's a certain amount of fixated capital going on. There's also the problem of turnover time. That when the turnover time is 1 year, Marx sets it at 1 year, but it's a bit arbitrary decision, but it has a logical basis in the fact that harvest is once a year in the temperate regions. But nevertheless, there are many things which are turnover in 6 months, and then there's some that'll be turnover in 18 months. And you wouldn't say the 18-month turnover is radically different from the annual turnover. So what you've got is a messy situation of fixated capital, some fixated capital, different turnover times of 2 years and 1 year and so on. So you wouldn't look at that and kind of say, look, there's a very distinctive circulatory process here that we can pull out of this. And when I say hardens, I mean at a certain point you look at it and you kind of say, well, actually, in this production process, they're using machines of a certain kind, and the machines last for 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, and the house is built for 30 years and so on. So at that point, you could kind of say, well, when it comes to things like building houses, something of that kind, it is so radically different that you could pull that out and say, okay, there's a circulatory process of building houses and living in them, which is separate from, you know, making ice cream or growing cabbages or something like that. So you go from the messiness of fixated capital and differentiated and different turnover times to a situation where you can clearly say this is really different, and therefore that we have to really talk about the average turnover time of an automobile, for example. What's the lifetime of an automobile? Well, you know, some people are going around, they've still got a 1920s automobile somewhere. But most of the time, there's an average turnover time of the lifetime of an automobile. And you say, well, that's going to get into, again, a sort of hardens into a circulatory circulation time of a certain sort. So when I say it hardens into a distinctive circulation time, I want to say that something crystallizes out of that messiness, which you're bound to have, and you never want to deny it. You don't want to say, you know, there's a pure circulation process going on there with no fixation. That's going on all the time. So, but out of that messiness comes something which is much more distinctive, and that therefore you could kind of say, all right, what is the turnover time of a house, or what is the turnover time? What is the lifetime of a house? What is the lifetime of a machine? What is the lifetime of a railroad? You know, I mean, all those kinds of things. And you kind of say, well, in the case of a railroad, the lifetime is very long, and you have a kind of a problem of, well, at what point do you say that you've amortized the original rails, but in fact you've also at a certain point have to replace the rails? So how long does the rails last? How long do the rolling stock last? So you've got all those kinds of questions. And it was a very interesting reading about that with Marx. Marx doesn't know how to handle this. So what does he do? He actually went to the manuals of the railway engineers to see what the replacement times were of all the bits and pieces in a steam engine, which is really interesting. So when I say hardens, it's always got these differentiations going on, but it's in that sense that I use the term hardens. Does that sort of make sense of that?
It does. And like thinking through it, just, realizing that all of these ideas are, things that you're thinking through. And so, not to expect part of, what I'm getting from reading this is it's requiring me to think through some of these ideas also. So.
Yeah, I hope so. And I hope the people that are actually sort of, and I must say, it's always helpful to me to have something in my mind, when I kind of sort of talk about turnover time or fixed capital or something of that kind. And in the same way that Marx went to the sort of manuals of the railroad engineers, I kind of think to myself, well, okay, how long does a car last? How long does and then what's the financing look like? And this section is very interesting because it relates back to falling rate and rising mass in a very interesting way. And it also looked forward to the whole kind of question of the circulation of interest-bearing capital, because at a certain point, you're not going to be able to talk about the depreciation of cars or the physical depreciation and the economic depreciation, which is about the interest rate and things of that kind. So there's a connection in this section to what's going to come, which is when we talk about the circulation of interest-bearing capital as a distinctive form of circulation. And that will be similarly the case when we get to that. So if I can preview it just a little bit, I may lend you $10 and get it back from you in 5 days, and maybe you'll give me back $10.01. I don't know, So, but we're making those transactions all the time. But you wouldn't say that's the circulation of interest-bearing capital as something kind of, which is separate and that. But you would find it immediately when you look at something like and say, well, it's interesting. General Motors, it sells cars. How does it sell cars? Well, a lot of people can't buy cars just straight out with cash. They need to get them, on a sort of have financing. So General Motors set up a long time ago something called the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which was a financing unit, and it simply dealt with financing, and it was about financing customers so they could buy the cars. So that then tells to me, well, this is the situation in which the car as a commodity attaches to an institution, in this case, General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which is actually providing credit and is therefore circulating interest-bearing capital, and you're paying a certain interest on the loan that you take out to buy the car over 5 years or however. And General Motors Acceptance Corporation became so big that in the crisis of 2009, it was also running into financial difficulty. And in order to be able for the government to step in and help it with its financial difficulty, it had to become a registered bank. So the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which started out as just simply providing credit to people to buy the cars, ends up being a bank. This is what I mean by the sort of distilling out that something that goes on historically. And when you think of it, you say, well, at what point did General Motors Acceptance Corporation actually move from just simply helping people buy a car by offering a little bit of credit? Well, how did it move from that to being a fully fledged bank? And that's what I mean about, sort of the crystallization out or the hardening of a certain circulatory process, so that you can say distinctively it is now circulating interest-bearing capital, and therefore it can be actually classified as a bank as opposed to somebody, the local grocer who lets you buy something on credit, and then you pay them off, in a couple of weeks or something of that kind, which is a different kind of operation, not the same as a General Motors Acceptance Corporation. Because one of the things we're dealing with all of the time is a very flexible, fluid kind of situation, and lots of ambiguity. But at a certain point, the ambiguity gets out of the way, and you say, well, now's the point where we can actually talk about the circulation of fixed capital as hardening into something which is very distinctive, very special, and has specific qualities. So who else has some sorts of comments? Clarification? Any clarification?
Yeah, I have a clarification question about the use of dissolve. So I'm on the top of page 9, kind of near where you were talking about the hardening of capital, and that last sentence is, when value loses its motion, then capital is dissolved. And I wanted to know, are you using that sort of synonymously with depreciation and devaluation, or are you getting at something else there?
Well, no,
Yeah.
it's just saying that, and again, it's part of the fluidity and mess you're dealing with all of the time. If the motion of a particular commodity stops, at what point does it become worthless? And when I say dissolve, there's a dissolution process, if you want to call it that, or a dissolving. And it's a very slow process. Now, some commodities, we could start with the physical side. What is the lifetime of a commodity? Well, there are a lot of perishable commodities. For instance, at what point do the raspberries I'm trying to sell become unsaleable because they've been sitting around too long and they've just gone to mush? So you would say the commodity actually, which has value at a certain time, the value starts to disappear over time, and when it goes to mush, the value's evaporated and dissolved, or whichever how you want to put it. So now that's true of raspberries, but that's not true of a house. So what may happen with a house is it may become unlivable at a certain point, and so that you're out in the countryside and you see this house and you see kind of it's completely, and the rafters are rotted and it's fallen down, and so you see a sort of collapsed house, and you say, well, at some point the value which was incorporated in that house disappeared. Now, of course, it disappeared over a long period of time. In the case of the raspberries, it may disappear overnight. In the case of a house, it may disappear over 30 years. There's a leak in the roof, it's not fixed. So that starts to rot everything in the place, and suddenly the stanchions give away and the house collapses. It's no longer useful for anything. So it's really, again, I'm using a language of dissolution or dissolving or evaporating or something of that kind in order to say, well, it's not as if, on Thursday, the 15th at 9:30, the house stopped being a house. There was a long process of dissolution of the house into something that was not a house, and in the end is nothing. So again, it's a language where I'm trying to mirror the way in which things happen in the real world. I mean, and in doing that, you have to recognize that, like fixation and so on, it's a messy kind of concept, and this house maybe only lasts 10 or 15 years, and then it's sort of and there's a lot of temporary housing, which turns out to be permanent housing. A lot of trailer parks were set up as temporary housing, and then became, sort of permanent. So we want a theory that has a language which indicates that it has this kind of tentative relationship to physical and economic processes that are going on in the world around, and at the same time is clear enough so that we can understand the theory of capital and what capital is about in terms of, say, the circulation time of a house, the production time of certain commodities, which will be an annual basis, an agricultural commodity, and things of that sort. So using words like that, I tend to use them to sort of say, well, okay, this is not a clear-cut thing that it is a commodity this moment and it's not a commodity that moment. No, it's a commodity and it gradually dissolves. And at a certain point you wake up and say, it's no longer a commodity. It's gone. But the going can sometimes take a number of years, and sometimes, like if I'm selling raspberries, it can be very short.
Yeah, I actually really like the word. Maybe that's why I was drawn to it. But I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding how you were using it. So the invocation of nature and time there, I think is good. But thanks for that explanation. And
actually, Marx doesn't use dissolved. He later, at a certain point in the Grundrisse, he spent a lot of time talking about dissolution, and particularly talking about the dissolution of older forms of money and the rise of the capitalist form of money. So he uses the dissolution kind of argument, and again he wants to say that it wasn't as if one day you had feudalism, the next day you had capitalism. No, there was a long period, he says, when there was a dissolution was going on, and that's a very interesting kind of way to look at what was happening in late medieval period, when you get the dissolution of feudal land ownership rights and certain agrarian practices and so on. So the word dissolution is one which Marx resorts to quite a lot in the Grundrisse, but I use dissolved in this instance as to get at what we were talking about. Yeah. Any other questions?
Actually have a follow-up to that, if it's okay. Yeah. So I was thinking about the value in motion and that same idea that when value loses its motion, what happens? It dissolves. And so in the example of the home, in the example you gave, the home is dissolving or losing value. But in the example of real estate, for example, it can increase in value. So is that where the interest-bearing capital kind of part will come in? So I'm just kind of thinking through the example of houses and real estate and how you buy a home, but then even though it maybe seems fixed, it continues to accrue or can continue to accrue in value, even though it's Well,
one of the difficulties here, which I didn't get into, maybe I should have done, is the fact that these long-term fixed capital items, and take a house, for example, they require maintenance. So, you have a clapboard house, you've got to paint it every 3 years. The roof needs to be changed every, 30 years. The light bulbs need to be changed every 6 months. In other words, when you have a complex commodity like a house or an automobile or something like that, it takes maintenance. And if you have a car, you know, these days the maintenance is quite expensive. You'll find yourself, you know, having to get new tires and this kind of thing. And so different components depreciate at different rates and have different lifetimes. And if you look at a car and after, say, you've still got and somebody's driving that 1920s car around, you say to yourself, well, you know, that's not the original car. Right? I mean, it has been renewed and replaced, and this has been done to it, and that has been done to it. So there's a real kind of problem about the value of a car. If the value of the car simply depreciated without any maintenance, that would be one thing. But what the problem with the car is, you've got maintenance. Now, do you incorporate the maintenance costs into as a sort of an item in the original cost? That is, the car costs you $20,000. The maintenance costs over the next 5 years are going to be $10,000. Do you then say, well, therefore the value of the car you really is 30? In other words, and that will also come with improvements. For instance, on real estate was an obvious case. If you just maintain a property, that's one thing, but a lot of people improve it. So in which case, actually, you know, you get somebody in, you go to a firm, and a firm of painters comes in and paints your house for you and fixes the gutters and does all these things. So how do we then deal with the value of a house and the value of the improvements which we might add into it? I might buy a house and the bathroom is a terrible, crappy place, and I get a new bathroom, and every real estate agent will tell you that really adds a lot of value to the house. And if the house is worth $200,000, then when you've got a new bathroom, it's going to be worth $225,000 because it's got a beautiful, spiffy bathroom. And those kinds of things. So you have that aspect to it. Now, the other issue you're raising, which is a separate issue from the maintenance, but I wanted to throw the maintenance in there because it also makes it messy, and I didn't talk about it in the paper, and probably I should have talked more about the maintenance kind of question. But what you're looking at now is that at a certain point, the house is no longer just a house. I mean, a house has a use value, but it also has an exchange value. And it also is existing in a market where the market is moving in a certain kind of way, where market prices are changing. And therefore, the house moves from being a use value as something that is lived in to being an asset, a financial asset that I can pass on to my kids. You know, one of the major ways of intergenerational wealth transfer is through housing, but it can also become a speculative instrument. You can speculate on it. I can buy a house and speculate on its value, as a lot of people did just before the big crisis of 2008. Many people started to buy houses as a speculative instrument. Now, when that happens, the monetary value of the house is going to rise without there necessarily being any physical improvement at all. This is getting into kind of this week and next week's session, because then you say, I mean, when I was a kid, for example, by and large, in a working class or lower middle class or middle class neighborhood, home ownership was about having a secure place to live. It was a physical thing. It was about use value. It was about a place, you know, about shelter and security and all kinds of things like that, and having a space you can call your own and so on. So you have all those elements to it, and you could describe those use values. it happened also to be a form of saving that could be passed on to the next generation, so that when my parents died, I inherited the house, and that allowed me either to go live in the house, or I could sell the house and go to the house somewhere else. So the form of saving was terribly important. But then that started to become very much the case after, in Britain, for example, after Margaret Thatcher came in and started selling off all of the social housing, because basically there's a lot of social housing that was providing housing as a use value, didn't provide any kind of as a form of saving to pass on to next generation. So Margaret Thatcher started to privatize all the social housing, so people could start to use it as a vehicle for saving for the next generation. And people could start to speculate in the value of it and housing values of it. So actually the meaning of the house, which is an interesting consumption item, the meaning of the house changed from physical use value to form of saving to speculative instrument. Now, what do you do when you buy a house these days? Are you buying it for reasons of speculation, for reasons of saving, or for a place to live in? And people do all three. But in some cases, they just do one. So back in 2008, you would find all kinds of people who were buying houses like crazy because it was a speculative instrument. And of course, the market crashed and they all lost out. But or if they sold before the crash, they didn't lose out. They actually gained a lot. So there's those issues arise in certain markets. And right now, as we will begin to see in the next session, we live in a world where there's a lot of more speculative and there's a lot more concern with asset values, not only houses, but things like cars, paintings, the art market, and all kinds of things like that are really about, are there commodities around which take on the quality of asset values, and is there a market in those asset values, and if so, what is that market about, and how does that market work, and how does it connect to the circulation of interest-bearing capital and borrowings and financings and all the rest of it? Are we living in a much more financialized world where the sort of story you would tell about a house on the basis of what we've discussed today is very different from the story that we will tell about a house in 2 or 3 weeks' time when we work through some of these other issues. Any other kind of questions? Chris, do you have some problems?
I guess there's something. This is just, I don't know if there's a good answer for this, but you talk about like the Hudson Yards development, and there's kind of this line of like a new tunnel under the Hudson River would be something entirely different. I guess I just wonder, like, why does money end up going into like kind of large, useless projects? But when there's like so much need, like why can't this money go and be put to use that people like actively need, that we have need for? I don't understand. I guess kind of confused with how things play out. Is it about policy and regulation that dictate the form of how this capital manifests? I don't understand.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, there's a shortage of. New York has a tremendous shortage of affordable housing, and it has something like 60,000 homeless people in the city, about a third of whom are kids. So you would expect that there will be a massive investment in affordable housing. And that's where the need is. But the trouble is, the people who want affordable housing, it has to be affordable because they don't have any money. So they're not a worthwhile market. So if you look around New York right now, there's a tremendous amount of building going on, but none of it, or very little of it, is going towards affordable housing. It's going to the people who've got the money. And of course, a lot of it was going to Russian oligarchs who were kind of, just saving money and speculating in penthouses on Park Avenue and all the rest of it. And so something like Hudson Yards comes up. And I mean, Hudson Yards was a scandal for the following reason. That a lot of the financing came from this sort of investment for a visa program, where if you come into a country and you want to get a visa to live in the United States, or a residence visa in the United States, you can buy it by having investment of, say, and I can't remember whether it's $1 million or $500,000. That is, you say, I am going to invest $1 million in the United States, and if you do that, they'll give you a green card or whatever else. So if you're a foreigner, so a lot of that, but that program said that $1 million should be invested in an area which is designated as needy area. That is, it should go to some place that is desperately in need of affordable housing, and an area of the city which is under considerable duress and is classified in the sense of being impoverished. So the idea behind the legislation was there were these people who were willing to put up $1 million. That $1 million could be used to improve a neighborhood which was very low income, poor, and had housing quality deficit. Okay, so you would expect this. So this was how a lot of the money got into Hudson Yards, because what they did was they designated an area in the city that was, quote, needy, and it started out in the middle of the Bronx. It then went all the way down through Central Park. And then when it got to the bottom of Central Park, it dog-legged over to the west side to incorporate Hudson Yards. So they said, this is the community that is very needy, because all those people in the Bronx are very needy. And so, housing distress and all the rest of it. So they kind of said, so Hudson Yards was funded by that kind of money, but it was funded in this kind of, I think, corrupt way. But you can see why. I mean, okay, if they actually built affordable housing for people in the Bronx, and there was going to be massive improvement for the population and of the low income part of the Bronx, if that was going to be the case, then this wouldn't be a sort of a this would not be a pretty kind of urbanization project. So they got it into Hudson Yards, and of course Hudson Yards has all kinds of crazy things going on, and is now actually, I can think, a bit of an economic disaster. So yeah, I mean, this is the irrationality of a system where if you don't have the money, and you don't have the effective demand, which is need backed by money, by ability to pay, then you're not going to be incorporated in the system, and nobody's going to build housing for you. There's plenty of housing being built, as you see, all around New York City, and all of it is for middle or upper middle class, and some of it is for kind of penthouse kind of qualifications. So it's a crazy sort of setup. But it's a classic case, though, because on the one hand, if I'd known all of this when Hudson Yards was being proposed, and I went there and I protested and started to kind of organize everybody to say, look, we shouldn't do this, blah 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 blah. Guess who would come out and be against me?
Construction unions?
Yes, construction unions and developers and the financiers and all the rest of it. And the construction unions would come out like crazy and sort of go after me. And this is one of my points about investment in fixed capital. At a certain point, it sometimes doesn't matter if the system is any good and if it goes bankrupt, because all of the people who built it have come out of it very well. I mean, the construction unions came out of Hudson Yards very well. The people who did all the furnishings, the raw materials people, the cement producers, the glass producers, all this, they all got their money, and they all did extremely well out of the whole thing. And at the end of the day, there's that thing there. And then, well, you know, doesn't matter if it's the equivalent of a bridge to nowhere. And in fact, it's quite a familiar story that very large investment projects of this kind do go belly up. And when they go belly up, they get devalued, and so that somebody can move in at very low price and actually use them. Actually, the case where this was a classic case was the London Underground system. When the London Underground was built around 1900 or something like that, it was touted as a great project. And they assembled the capital. And one of the reasons I know about this is because a lot of the capital came from very rich families in Maryland. Because in 1998 or something like that, a lot of the family industries, like the sugar industry, for example, all sold out to the national cartels. So the local sugar merchants sold out to Domino's Sugar. So if you go to Baltimore, you'll see a big Domino Sugar sign and Domino Sugar thing. So Domino Sugar was a very big thing. So a lot of the rich families sold out their shares in the cartels, and then they were looking for profitable investments. And somebody came along and said, look, the London Underground is a fantastic investment. Here's a big city, needs an underground. It's going to be a fantastic kind of thing. And they got into it and they dug a lot of the tunnels. But by the time they got through digging the tunnels, they'd run out of money. And they were in dire straits, and they went bankrupt. So a lot of the Maryland families suddenly lost all the money they got from the cartels, and so they lost that money. But then the tunnels were already built. Okay. So they went bankrupt, and so all the tunnels are sitting, not all of them, but a lot of the tunnels are already there. So along came another company and said, okay, well, we'll pay 10 cents on the dollar for the tunnels. And they got all the tunnels, and then of course they fixed them up, and it became a very successful remunerative system. And Marx has this interesting kind of comment. He said, it's amazing the number of projects of this kind where the first wave of investors goes bankrupt, and the second wave comes in and makes a great profit on the basis of devalued assets, which have been bought out from the initial bankruptcy. So this is a kind of so it's very interesting looking at real estate, because I like how things get done, but a lot of it is irrational. I mean, that's the astonishing thing about capital, is how irrational it so often is. I mean, by definition, as I mentioned in the paper, an economic system that produces surpluses of capital and surpluses of labor side by side with no means to put them together in something constructive and useful, that's totally irrational. It's an irrational system. And that is, of course, what happened in the 1930s. In the 1930s, a mass of unemployed people, a mass of unemployed capital, and nobody knew how to put them together, so that it could benefit, the population, in particular the poor population. And of course, what Roosevelt was trying to do through the New Deal was, in fact, to put the surpluses of capital and labor back together and put them in a way that somehow or other they absorbed those surpluses in a way which got a capital accumulation going, and he didn't care about whether it was going to be relevant or not. And I mentioned the WPA, the Workers' Progress Administration, which was so if you drive out to Jones Beach, you'll find yourself going on the Jones Beach Highway, which was actually built as part of the New Deal kind of stuff. And well, it's okay, it is used, and so it can be said that that is useful. It did other things. They built the Blue Ridge Parkway. If ever you're driving through, West Virginia and down into Tennessee, you get at the Blue Ridge Parkway. That was something that was done in the 1930s by this kind of attempt to put surplus capital and surplus labor back to work and find a way to do it. And a lot of state projects were exactly about that, without any particular concern with whether it was going to be, improve profitability or it was going to be used or what. It just wanted to get the economy moving again. Any other kind of questions? So if not, I'm going to transition into the next part, which is the circulation of interest-bearing capital and the rise of finance capital. I think I indicated beforehand this was going to be rather difficult, and it was very difficult. And I've ended up dividing it into two. I tried to have it all in one, but it got too complicated, and even the one I've got is a little bit long for a particular reason, and I'm going to short circuit on a few of the passages. But obviously, to the degree that Marx makes this comment that interest-bearing capital is something that comes out of investments of fixed capital, particularly fixed capital of an independent kind, and when you look at the example of the transport industry or something like that, you can see why that is likely to be the case. So here we go, the circulation of interest-bearing capital. Up until this point in the development of the theory of capital, the prime engine of growth and transformation has been the pursuit of increasing labor productivity by individual capitalists operating under the coercive laws of competition. The engine continues to perform its role as capital becomes an abstract social force. Recall that passage in the last session. Operating over and above and sometimes even against the will of individual capitalists, in a world where technological innovation has become an autonomous and independent business. But we also know that the distinctive circulation processes engaged in fixed capital and consumption fund formation, in particular the real estate angle involved, elicits the circulation of interest-bearing capital as a necessary adjunct to the general circulation process of capital. Now, in our times, there is something else plainly afoot. Consider the following examples. And now I'm going to give a bunch of examples to really emphasize what it is we're dealing with. In the early 1990s, with the creation of the euro in mind, the states within the European Union coordinated their currency movements to operate within a narrow bound. But the British pound was persistently trading at its lower bound within this exchange rate mechanism. The suspicion grew that the pound was overvalued. In stepped George Soros with his large-scale and successful quantum fund. He bought up as many pounds as he could and converted them into Deutschmarks. This put further downward pressure on the value of the pound. Soros then borrowed as many pounds as he could lay hands on to convert into marks. The British government fought to maintain its position in the ERM by using its foreign exchange reserves to buy pounds and keep the value of the pound up. After a few days, the British reserves were exhausted. In itself, this was an amazing achievement. So the British government did the only other thing it could do to defend its position. It raised interest rates dramatically, hoping that the gap in interest rates between Germany and the UK would attract investors to buy pounds. It did not work. The pound was devalued on Black Wednesday, September 16th, 1992. Soros then converted his marks back into pounds at the new and very favorable rate, returned the funds he had borrowed to the banks, paid them some interest, and took a net profit of at least £1 billion for himself. In the process, he produced absolutely nothing. He had legally and successfully robbed the British taxpayer of £1 billion or more pounds. He had used the mass of value he already possessed to gain access to more mass. He then used the much enhanced mass to speculate against the pound, ultimately diverting a considerable mass into his own pocket. The pursuit of relative surplus value had nothing whatsoever to do with this. Soros' key leverage was access to a huge mass of money. Very few people in a population have access of that sort. I certainly do not. I would have been delighted if I could have gone into a bank and said, lend me £1 billion. I'm going to speculate against the pound and the Deutschmark. His only objective was appropriation, not production. And this, of course, is how the rich get richer without making anything. Soros was later implicated, along with several other prominent and powerful financiers, in an operation to destabilize the Thai baht. But that operation was far more extensive and long drawn out, since it turned out to be the precursor to the financial crisis that racked East and Southeast Asia in 1997-8. Joseph Stiglitz, interestingly, outlines a conspiracy theory which he himself does not believe in, but which was very common in the region, to explain what happened. And it goes like this. The IMF first told countries in Asia to open up their markets to short-term capital. Countries did it and money flooded in, but then just as suddenly it flowed out. The IMF then said interest rates should be raised and there should be a fiscal contraction, and a deep recession was induced. As asset prices plummeted, the IMF urged affected countries to sell their assets at bargain basement prices. The sales were handled by the same foreign institutions who precipitated the crisis by pulling out their money. These banks took large commissions, selling the troubled companies or splitting them up, just as they had got large foreign commissions guiding investments into the countries in the first place. As events unfolded, cynicism grew, Stiglitz notes. Foreign financial companies made huge profits from buying at fire sale prices and later selling at more normal prices. Stiglitz insists, however, that the IMF was not participating in a conspiracy, no matter how plausible conspiracy theory appeared to be to those most grossly affected by the crisis on the ground. The IMF, Stiglitz argues, was simply, quote, reflecting the interests and ideology of the Western financial community. In other words, and this is the interesting thing about this statement, the IMF was simply doing capitalist business as usual. The free market system and the equalization of the rate of profit produced a result that was indistinguishable from what would have been produced by an active conspiracy of the sort that Stiglitz outlines. Those with deep pockets, command over the mass, can wait out any turbulence in the market, while all those firms that were a payment or two away from bankruptcy can be forced, no matter what their rate of profit, to give up whatever assets they control for a trivial sum when there is a liquidity squeeze. It is command over the mass that matters. As Wade and Veneroso remark in an article, very interesting article on the topic, financial crises have always caused transfers of ownership and power of those who keep their own assets intact and who are in a position to create credit. And the Asian crisis is no exception. There is no doubt that Western and Japanese corporations are the big winners. The combination of massive devaluations, IMF-pushed financial liberalization, and IMF-facilitated recovery may even precipitate the biggest peacetime transfer of asset values from domestic to foreign owners in the past 50 years anywhere in the world. One recalls the statements attributed to once US Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon back in the 1920s. In a depression, assets return to their rightful owners, that is, him. Consider further the case of Stephen Schwarzman, co-founder and CEO of the private equity company Blackstone. By 2019, he had accumulated a personal net worth of $14.4 billion, seeking entry into philanthropy heaven by donations of $350 million to MIT and £150 to Oxford to support the teaching of the humanities, of all things. He is also, it turns out, an avid supporter of Donald Trump. The rise of Blackstone to being by far the largest landlord in the world by 2018 with more than 200 billion of asset values under management, is a classic contemporary tale. The financial crisis of 2008 originated in the housing mortgage market, in the consumption fund no less, primarily in the United States, with high concentrations of distress in California and the American Southwest, along with Florida and Georgia. From the mid-1990s on, high-risk, low-income populations, particularly people of color, immigrants, and women as single heads of households, were enticed into home ownership by teaser mortgages and lax oversight in the granting of so-called subprime mortgages. Financial institutions packaged these mortgages into collateralized debt obligations, sold on to unsuspecting investors all around the world, from the municipal governments in Norway to investment arms of major banks, such as Paribas in France. These investments were, it was claimed, as safe as houses. The ratings agencies that are supposed to attest to their viability gave them AAA ratings. And it turns out this was a corrupt option. When the housing market tanked in 2006-08, it became clear that many of the CDOs were worthless. As the teaser mortgages matured and foreclosures surged. Too bad for the municipal governments in Norway and Paribas. The foreclosure rules were savagely enforced, in many instances illegally so. The result was a vast pool of foreclosed properties on the books of the banks, acquired in large part from Latinx and African American populations who lost up to 80% of their asset wealth in the crisis. Blackstone borrowed large sums of capital to take the properties off the books of the banks at fire sale prices. It then fixed them up and put them back on the market as profitable rentals. With pension funds, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds desperate in the wake of the crisis to find adequate rates of return on their capital, Blackstone had access to massive amounts of investment capital, which it borrowed at modest interest rates to mount large-scale real estate operations all around the world. In 2007, Blackstone had nearly 20 billion in real estate assets under management, but by 2019, it had increased its holdings sevenfold. Blackstone management bragged was now big enough to undertake operations beyond the capacity of any competitor anywhere in the world. This is very much a story, again and again, of getting into a monopoly position as fast as you can. Blackstone had not let a good crisis go to waste. It had engineered a huge transfer of property rights from one class to another. By 2012, Blackstone was spending 100 million a week on houses. It had already laid out 1.5 billion to purchase 10,000 foreclosed properties. By 2014, just 2 years later, it had spent 5 times that, 7.8 billion, to buy out 41,000 single-family homes in 14 cities from Seattle to Miami, with the greatest concentrations in Arizona, California, Florida, and Georgia. And there's a very good book you can read on this by Aaron Glantz, which is called Home Records. And most of this information comes from there. California's crisis of lack of affordable housing deepened as Blackstone converted to high-end rentals after a wave of evictions of low-income populations from the troubled rental complexes it also acquired. Here is the irony. Some of those evicted were pensioners dependent upon the California State Pension Fund, which invested so heavily in Blackstone's operations. The pensioners, in effect, secured their pensions by way of their own evictions. Blackstone is now almost certainly poised to make another killing. During the pandemic, many households could not afford to either pay their mortgage or their rent. While a moratorium on evictions was extended in the United States to later in 2021, it finally gave out, clogging the courts in all the major cities with eviction claims. I then use an example from Brooklyn, an affordable housing project in Brooklyn, goes on the same way, but I'm going to skip that one. You can read this. Now, several of the primary cabinet members of the Trump administration, it turned out, made their billions out of cleaning up the bank failures that occurred after 2007 and 8. Steve Mnuchin, Trump's Treasury Secretary, specialized in taking over failed banks at a hefty discount. For example, $900 million for a bank with 12.8 billion in assets on paper and 8.6 billion in deposits. The trick was to accelerate foreclosures, sometimes on homeowners who were not even delinquent. The foreclosed houses would then be sold on at depressed market prices to investment companies to be converted into profitable rentals, as in the case of Blackstone. The investors could get a house for $20,000 and rent it out for $1,000 a month and get their money back in 2 years. The federal government made up the difference for the banks between the achieved price paid by, for example, Blackstone, and the original paper value of the mortgage. The government actually paid out $2.7 billion to cover the bank's losses on the old loans. Mnuchin, who managed one of these banks, was paid a hefty salary. When the bank eventually returned to profitability, it was sold at a premium price, which contributed to Mnuchin becoming a multi-billionaire in the Trump orbit, thanks mainly to the largesse of the federal government. The federal government in all of these cases is the backup. An alternative option to put the foreclosed homes out of the reach of investor speculators and into the hands of affordable housing nonprofits was never seriously considered. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to attack the problem of lack of affordable housing was lost, while people like Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, and Steve Schwarzman gleefully confirmed their status among the billionaires club of Trump real estate manipulator supporters. Now, I'm citing these examples because I want to lay an historical materials basis to explore the degree to which the theory of capital has to be revised, extended, or radically transformed in order to grasp its qualities in its current phase. Plainly, the theory of relative surplus value and all that flows therefrom, such as the law of the falling rate and rising mass of profit, is not at all helpful in seeking to interpret local struggles or the class formation of the Schwarzman-Mnuchin sort. This is not, however, the moment to assert some idealist interpretation in which arbitrary conceptual and policy shifts, important though these may have been, lie at the root of emergent understandings of what capital is all about. I reiterate Marx's injunction in the Grundrisse, and this is a very important thing for me. Abstractions and ideas are nothing more than the theoretical expression of those material relations which are their lord and master. My purpose in these earlier examples was to talk about what are the material relations, which are the lord and master. Relations can be expressed, of course, and this is Marx writing, only in ideas. And thus philosophers have determined the reign of ideas to be the peculiarity of the new age. This reign then appears within the consciousness of individuals as the reign of ideas, and belief in the permanence of these ideas is consolidated, nourished, and inculcated by the ruling classes by all means available. To what ideas, therefore, do the material relations and practices described in the above examples give rise? Now, obviously, the big idea in the background to this is the idea of the neoliberal counter-revolution and the displacement of Keynesian economics. To this, I add a second methodological injunction, which comes from Marx. If there is indeed a compelling case for revising or even revolutionizing the concept and theory of capital, which is what we're after here, so far advanced, to take account of these cases, then the roots of these transformations should be discernible in earlier practices and theoretical formulations. It has to be, if you like, capable of being expressed through the analysis of the totality. My position on this latter point is quite simple. Marx, in his chapters on money and finance, and on merchant and landed capital in Volume 3 of Capital, constructed a far more advanced basis for theorizing the inner structure of the capitalist mode of production. Most presentations on Marx's political economy have failed to appreciate Marx's admittedly incomplete findings. Marx structured his investigations by a double movement. The first is to take up particular moments, such as landed capital or finance capital, in isolation from the totality, much as a cardiologist will examine how the heart works and what it does in the human body. In the second movement, Marx reintegrates his particular findings into the totality. In so doing, he finds concepts and ideas have to be reinterpreted, sometimes dramatically, in the light of this broader understanding. The cardiology that emerges out of a holistic approach to medicine is rather different from that arising from narrow technical analysis, and so it is in the case of taking up landed capital and finance capital within the totality. In volume 3 of Capital, Marx undertakes the first of these moves, but he never fully accomplished the second, except by way of occasional unsystematic flashes of insight. Now, this conclusion was something that I reached many years ago when I wrote The Limits to Capital, which was published in 1982. In section 3 of that book, I took up Marx's theory of banking, credit, finance, and interest, which most political economists had up until then ignored. At that time, I did not, however, deploy the concept of totality in the way I now do. Here, then, is some of Marx's commentary on the role of interest-bearing capital and the financial system as far as he understood it in his place and time. The credit system as we now know it originated as the servant of fixed capital and consumption fund formation, for the reasons we've established last week. This was and it also exists, of course, as a vehicle to procure state funding, while serving the needs of monetary coordination across production systems with radically different turnover times. In the Grundrisse, the bankers and financiers, however, emerge as a distinctive class. Through them, capital equips itself with a central nervous system adequate to the needs of the circulation and accumulation of capital as a whole. And I quote from Marx, "In the money market," Marx observes, "capital is posited in its totality. There it determines prices, gives work, regulates production, in a word, is the source of production. Planning for the economy increasingly shifts, as Michael Hudson, for one, insists, from the state into the corridors of the financial institutions, such as Goldman Sachs. In Marx's time, therefore, the lineaments of today's future was clearly foretold. And here I quote from Marx. In interest-bearing capital, the capital relation reaches its most externalized and fetishized form. In interest-bearing capital, this automatic fetish is elaborated into its pure form, self-valorizing value, money that makes money. And in this form, it no longer bears any marks of its origin, which of course is exactly how Soros behaved. But its origin lies, says Marx, in wage labor. The social relation is consummated in the relationship of a thing, money, to itself. The mass of centralized money power both reproduces and augments itself. This is, Marx says, capital mystification in its most glaring form. The vulgar economist wants to present capital as an independent source of wealth, of value creation. This form is, of course, a godsend, a form in which the source of profit is no longer recognizable, and in which the result of the capitalist production process, separated from the process itself, obtains an autonomous existence. It is this that promotes the rise of a class of men, the rentiers or investor class, who by the labors of their ancestors find themselves in possession of funds sufficiently ample to afford a handsome maintenance from the interest alone. Continue citing from Marx. Interest-bearing capital, or as we may call it in its antiquated form, usurer's capital, belongs together with its twin brother, merchant's capital, to the antediluvian forms of capital that long precede the capitalist mode of production and are to be found in the most diverse economic forms of society. But in the course of its evolution, industrial capital must subjugate usurers and merchants' capital and transform them into derived or special functions of itself. Where capitalist production has become the dominant mode of production, interest-bearing capital is dominated by industrial capital. And commercial capital becomes merely a form of industrial capital. But first of them but both of them must first be destroyed as independent forms and subordinated to industrial capital. The real way this happens is the creation of a procedure specific to itself, the credit system. The credit system is its own creation. But as credit becomes more and more indispensable in, for example, reducing the cost and time of circulation, so the development of the production process extends credit, and credit leads to the extension of industrial and commercial operations. But the money capital brought together with the credit system is not interested in production per se, but only in appropriation. The money capitalist is indifferent to the ultimate source of revenue and invests in government debt, mortgages, stocks and shares, commodity futures, or whatever, depending upon the rate of return. All connection to the actual expansion process of a capital is thus completely lost. And the conception of capital as something which automatic self-expansion properties is thereby strengthened. The danger then lurks that lending will not be for productive purposes, but solely for appropriation. The circulation of interest-bearing capital becomes the fountainhead of all manner of insane forms. Everything is doubled and trebled and transformed into a mere phantom of the imagination, such that even an accumulation of debts can appear as an accumulation of capital. The credit system registers the height of distortion in which the accumulation of claims far outruns real production. The credit system that began as a faithful servant of industrial capital becomes its malignant, mutant master. Marx clearly saw the potentiality for money capital to run amok within the credit system. Nothing, therefore, that is portrayed in the above examples is untoward or surprising. In other words, Marx's conception of credit, as he's articulating it here, is broadly consistent with the kinds of examples which we're early looking at of behavior of George Soros and Blackstone. But we now have a choice as to how to view this evolutionary movement. We can interpret it as the inevitable outcome of a teleological movement, or as a contingent outcome depending upon historical accidents, environmental conditions, and the balance of class and other social and geopolitical forces. Contemporary ruling classes prefer the teleological interpretation. There is no alternative, said Margaret Thatcher. And that is indeed the way in which capital is now presented to us. Or that this is the proper end of history, Fukuyama, because it confirms the inevitability of their power. The more contingent explanation, which I will favor, poses the puzzle of identifying possible lines of collective action and social forces to somehow or other change the trajectory of human history. Now, before I think I've mentioned that Marx occasionally resorts to teleological modes of thinking, in which communism is the ultimate state. But in the Grundrisse, it's all contingent and open. And where we go is dependent upon how we mobilize ourselves, class forces, and contingent accidental events. The most obvious point, however, where an emphasis upon continuity and contingency becomes blindingly obvious, concerns the role of the mass of value. George Soros had at his fingertips a huge mass of capital in money form that he could call upon and put to use to add to the mass under his control. The same is true both in the case of Amazon's borrowing and Blackstone's unrivaled assemblage of investment money power. The individuals leading these enterprises all emerge as freshly minted billionaires, constituting an oligarchy endowed with immense economic and political power. It is not hard here to trace an evolutionary thread in Marx's history of capital's becoming. If the basic law of capital is to maximize the production of surplus value and thereby produce an ever-increasing mass of capital, and if the derivative law, thanks to the emphasis upon rising productivity of labor, of falling rate and rising mass is fully operative, then there is a simple way in which these modest origins might over time generate the monstrous masses that Marx evidently criticized and which Soros et al. So ruthlessly mobilize. But in all of the cases cited, with the exception of Amazon, no real value is produced, though plenty is appropriated. The labor of Soros, Mnuchin, Schwartzman, along with that of all those employed with them, is unproductive labor. They are rentiers, not producers. They live and flourish on the basis of unearned income. The rising mass of capital and its seemingly magical capacity, given a fetish disguise for self-augmentation, is in the forefront of this process. But it is only the monetary mass that truly matters. While the mass of capital engaged in production can be impressive, as the Manchester case demonstrated to Marx, its growth is physically and economically limited, even though the industrial cities of Foxconn in Shenzhen or Rana Plaza in Dhaka are astonishingly large configurations of activity. Merchant capital, like Walmart and IKEA, likewise has both economic and physical limitations on the mass it can generate and handle, in part because its very mission is to speed up and not delay the circulation of commodities. There is nothing insurmountable, however, in the assemblage, concentration, and centralization of money power. Money capital can be accumulated without limit. It is therefore to the circulation of capital in money form that we should look for clues as to the current evolutionary trajectory of capital. The first intermediate step is to take up what Marx in Volume 1 of Capital calls the laws of increasing centralization of capital. These laws incorporate the principle, already made much of in former sessions, that the larger the mass of capital, the faster its increase, even when the rate of profit is declining. The concentration of capital comes about as surplus value is incrementally reincorporated in the circulation of productive capital, but that is a very slow process. And this incremental process pales into insignificance compared to the centralization of capital procured by other means such as competitive takeover of weaker firms, mergers and acquisitions, the formation of joint stock companies, and above all, by way of the credit system. The leveraged buyouts that currently so often accompany mergers and acquisitions permit investors to assemble a mass of borrowed capital to buy out a large concern while using very little of their own money. They subsequently use the earnings of that large concern to pay off the interest and the principal in subsequent years. This, for example, was how the Glazer family acquired the soccer club Manchester United. Sorry, I have to get into soccer here. The Glazer family, US family, acquired the soccer club Manchester United. And the fans have many ill feelings at how much revenue is taken up with debt service for the benefit of the Glazer family, because their income is retiring their debt, rather than actually being applied to the financial well-being of the club. The club is in effect a milk cow for the Glazer family. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx only mentions increasing centralization in passing, even as he makes clear that increasing centralization and accumulation of capital go hand in hand. You cannot have massive accumulation of capital without centralization. This relation is facilitated and is much enhanced, of course, by the appeal to the credit system. And this is what plays a central role in the dynamics of the capitalist mode of production. The increasing centralization of capital has, in short, a critical role to play in shaping the dynamics of the inner structure of capital. The stock market that came into its own in Marx's time played a major, and in Marx's view, positive role in this, facilitating the centralization and, in Marx's language, the socialization of capital. But it also gave rise, of course, to speculation in asset values, along with takeovers of smaller companies by conglomerate groups. In our own times, the leading hedge funds and private equity companies are a major force for this increasing centralization of capital. While hedging has been a long-standing practice in the history of capitalism, for example, farmers insuring against crop failure, the hedge funds that now dominate investment on Wall Street and in the City of London are something entirely new. Blackwater Associates, for example, was founded in 1975, and I think the date is significant. It now manages 160 billion of funds, talk about the mass, invested on behalf of public and private pension funds, university endowments, government entities, and very wealthy individuals. It is reputed to have earned $47 billion for its investors over the years. And Ray Dalio, its CEO, is now one of the richest persons and leading financial gurus in the world, on the basis of taking 20% of earnings gained for himself. Dalio now warns of a coming class war of poor against the rich. And for Warren Buffett, the class war is already here. Yes, he said, there is a class war, and it's my class that is waging it, and we are winning. 1975 was not only remarkable, of course, for the founding of Blackwater Associates. It was also the year of the New York fiscal crisis, the turn of the Pinochet regime from Keynesian to Chicago boy supply-side theory in Chile, and the tectonic shift in ideas and theorizations that would ultimately produce the neoliberal counter-revolution led by Thatcher and Reagan when they came into political power. However, at a certain point, Marx asserts, the capitalists themselves are forced to recognize and use the distinction between the productive monetary aspects of their activities. When industrial capitalists find themselves in possession of capital in the money form, they face an existential choice between reinvesting in their distinctive line of production and confirming their identity as industrialists, or lending the money out to others in return for an interest payment, in which case they convert to the identity of rentier, someone living off unearned income. They can do this either directly or indirectly with the help of financial mediators. The peculiarity here is that money, the representation or expression of value, takes on a commodity form, which has a use value. It can be used to produce surplus value, and an exchange value, the rate of interest. Marx divides the surplus value between that part which commands a payment, profit, for the organization of productive activity, and that part which pays obeisance to ownership of sheer money power in return for interest. While individual capitalists may receive the whole surplus value, they do so as divided personas. There is nothing furthermore that prevents an industrial capitalist operating entirely on borrowed funds in return for structured interest payments and principal repayments. The question of such finance and financial innovations has been there all along. Consider what happened with Haussmann's urbanization of Paris. And here I go into what happened in Paris in the Second Empire. And I then turn and say the same thing can be said about contemporary China. It is not, to take this contemporary case, that China longed for or just happened to get a sophisticated financial system and credit markets. After all, banks had effectively been abolished during the Cultural Revolution. China simply could not do without a certain level of financialization, as exemplified by development companies such as Evergrande and the massive growth in shadow banking through the sale of wealth management products. This was all critically important to its urbanization from the 1990s onwards. Whether or not these investments in China's built environment turn out to be productive and viable remains to be seen. But that is not their point. The immediate need, as it was in Haussmann's Paris, is to absorb surplus capital and labor in the field of circulating capital through spectacular urbanization and massive investment in physical infrastructures. But this could not be done without an adequate credit system, bridging private capital and local state finance and the circulation of interest-bearing capital. Maintaining the viability and profitability of circulating and extractive capital by way of potentially unprofitable investments and later devaluations in fixed capital is, as we've seen, a critical arm of capital gain. China is no exception. China could not proceed without a credit system as a servant of its needs. The question is whether it can avoid the malignant, mutant forms that now dominate in the United States and Europe. But there is yet another twist to the story. Much of the money that the financiers lend to invest in long-term fixed capital flows almost instantaneously, as we earlier saw, into the coffers of the circulating capitalists engaging in construction and development. Value and surplus value are instantaneously produced and recuperated by this activity in these spheres. It is the production of value in the form of factories and houses, schools and hospitals, toll roads and public works of all kinds that we are concerned with here. At some point, the question of how the value embodied in such assets can be circulated and recuperated has to be answered. Clear property rights to the realization of these values in the built environment have to be established. Some of the value can be recuperated directly by the imposition of user charges, toll roads, for example, or the payment of rents. Otherwise, the recuperation is indirect through state taxation to support the use of assets held in common. The flow of values can be capitalized to form market rights to these financial flows. This calls for further elaborations within the financial system, in which mortgages, annuities, long-term bonds, and the like become crucial. One consequence is that the circulation of interest-bearing as opposed to profit-seeking capital then prevails. The separation out of profit from interest is critical. Whereas the industrial capitalist is expected in Marx's initial formulation to gain a surplus value that combines profit with interest, the holder of the fixed capital or consumption fund asset will demand interest in the pursuit of their claims to a portion of the overall surplus. Marx sees this also as one of the counteracting influences to the falling rate of profit. To the degree that long-term investments of this kind have become far more prominent in capital's overall portfolio, then the circulation of interest-bearing capital also hardens into a distinctive circulatory system that locks onto the vast trove of monetizable assets that litter the landscape. Marx also does not pursue this in any detail, even as he tentatively registers its potential relevance. The idea that investments in non-productive long-term fixed capital might help counter the falling rate of profit is mentioned only once, for example. But the historical evidence of its growth and significance is, as we've already noted, overwhelming. The financial class does not appear to confront the workers directly, however. They are simply engaging in relations with other factions of capital. But here the perspective of the totality reveals something of great significance, and that is the rise of indebtedness as an alternative means to discipline whole populations, including the working mass, to the requirements of capital. Debts are a claim upon future labor. The more indebted the working populations, the more bound they are to give of their future labor to retire their debts. In advanced capitalism, working people and the population in general are now so thoroughly immersed and mired in mortgage debt, medical debt, student debt, auto loans, credit card, and consumer debt, buying huge amounts of commodities on the never-never, that they have succumbed to a virtual state of debt peonage. Debt-encumbered homeowners do not go on strike was an interesting saying to introduce the mortgage finance reforms of the 1930s that held out the promise of home ownership in the United States to the working population. While in Britain, the building societies that had the same policy objective were depicted explicitly as bulwarks against Bolshevism. But now the shadow of total indebtedness hangs over not only their present, but the future prospects of the working population. The moment of monetary autonomy and the circulation of labor capacity, which we just discussed in Section 2, and which in Marx's day dealt with rather paltry sums, has been elevated in the advanced capitalist countries to be one of the most signal features of social control of the working mass. Wage slavery now combines with debt peonage to ensure the political pacification of large segments of the population. The ruling ideas of the ruling classes, Thatcherite neoliberalism and its financial turn, prevail. The world is now mired and entangled in debts. The Imf Fiscal Monitor for 2016 surveyed the state of the global credit system. It summarized the global situation as follows. At 225% of world GDP, the global debt of the non-financial sector, comprising the general government, households, and non-financial firms, is currently at an all-time high. This debt amounts to $86,000 for every man, woman, and child on planet Earth, no matter whether they are engaged in economic activity or not. 2/3, amounting to about 100 trillion, consists of liabilities of the private sector, which has become one of the major drivers of credit growth in recent times. The share of government debt bottomed out in the mid-1970s at around 30% of global GDP, but has since risen closer to 100%. A major surge occurred in response to the crisis of 2007-2008. The pandemic of 2020 to 22 released another gush of public monies to ensure surplus liquidity everywhere. This rapidly rising mass of current indebtedness carries with it high economic risks. Any attempt at retiring the debt deflation as it is called, could trigger a serious economic crisis. The accumulation of capitals, Marx once presciently commented, increasingly appears as an accumulation of debt. At the same time, the increasing centralization of this enormous mass of wealth and power in a few hands proceeds apace. The global population of billionaires rose more than fivefold, and the largest fortunes rocketed past 100 billion after 2000. The disruption due to COVID virus reinforced this trend. As the virus spread, and I quote, banks injected $9 trillion into the economies worldwide, aiming to keep the world economy afloat. Much of that stimulus has gone into financial markets and from there into the net worth of the ultra-rich. The US Federal Reserve, for example, put 8.1 trillion into the economy through quantitative easing, about 1/3 of gross domestic product. The total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by 5 trillion to 13 trillion in 12 months, the most dramatic surge ever registered. The total number of billionaires worldwide increased by nearly 700 to 2,700. The biggest surge came in China, which added 238 billionaires, one every 36 hours, for a total of 626. This presents a serious challenge to the power, influence, and authority of the Chinese Communist Party. President Xi has in recent times taken steps to rein in China's largest corporations and to discipline, if not harass, its billionaire class. But China is now not far behind the US, which has 724 billionaires. In the US, the share of billionaire class in national wealth doubled from 10 to 20% between 2010 and 2020. By the beginning of 2021, the top 1% in the US hold 32% of the national wealth, while the bottom 50% commanded only 2% of it. No serious attempt is on the horizon to do anything whatever about this dramatically increasing inequality. The malignant consequences of an out-of-control expansion of the finance and credit system, considered as a teleological inevitability, are now plain to see. Sorry, that was a bit long. But and a bit dense. So you can enjoy yourself with the text. I'll put the text up as usual. And this is just part one of this, because there was a lot of questions arose. So I'm still not sure that I've got things right here, but it's interesting. So I'd be very interested to see what you make of it and if it makes any sense. But I mean, well, in a way, this, I suppose the summary argument would be that the credit system and all that goes with it was absolutely necessary and inevitable for the expansion of the capitalist system and dealing with the incongruities within the exchange structures and fixed capital formation and all the rest of it. But once you open the Pandora's box, the Pandora's box starts to take over, and it's like as I would say, university administrators. You know, they import administrators supposedly to support the faculty, but within a very short time, you find that they've become their boss and they're obnoxious and they're doing all kinds of awful things to you, and they're earning 5 times your salary, and blah blah blah. So it's a transition but it doesn't dissolve the totality. In other words, it's a building of the totality, building an egregious aspect to it, which is actually really problematic right now, because if there is some attempt at debt deflation, as we call it, the world is going to be in a terrible mess. But on the other hand, when you read those figures about the total indebtedness in the world and that we all owe, there's $86,000 worth of debt for every man, woman, and child, you kind of go, what? And what does that mean? And how does it work? So we'll talk a little further about it next time. Are there any immediate questions about this? Not in the chat room. Hey, was there anything in the chat room? This was a difficult section, so I'd like you to attempt a fairly close reading and a careful reading of it, and to see how well you grasp it. And there are things where I'm not quite sure, and we'll see how it goes. And next week we'll take on part 2 of this. Okay. So I think that's it. I think we're out of time, so let's leave it there, and thanks very much. We'll see you next